We begin with talks in the Middle East to end the war in Ukraine. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has arrived in Saudi Arabia ahead of talks scheduled with Ukrainian negotiators on Tuesday. It's the first time the two sides are meeting since Washington cut off military aid to Kyiv. Rubio says that he hopes the standoff over aid can be resolved, adding that whatever happens this Tuesday, it will be key. Volodymyr Zelenskyy is also in Saudi Arabia. The Ukrainian president will not participate in this week's negotiations. Instead, he is holding bilateral talks with Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Well, we asked GW correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv why Zelenskyy is going to Saudi Arabia if he's not taking part in those talks.
So Zelenskyy was heading to Riyadh a couple of weeks ago when we had those unexpected talks between the US and Russia in Riyadh also. So I think he just didn't want back then to be there at the same time but not invited. So I think this is going to be a bilateral thing between Ukraine and Saudi. Saudi is important, especially as a mediator in prisoner exchanges. They have done that in the past. That is something that the Ukrainian side is very keen on before any kind of negotiations about a ceasefire, is to, as a kind of trust-building exercise, see all Ukrainian prisoners return to home and then release all the Russian prisoners in exchange. So that could be part of it. Obviously, there is also a lot of speculation now that there is some kind of link to these talks with the American side, but also on protocol grounds, the president of Ukraine is not going to negotiate with, Marco Rubio or other kind of officials. That is not the kind of level that is being held tomorrow. But certainly, there's a lot of speculation that there are messages being conveyed there and that there might be more to this than we've been hearing so far.
That was Nick Connolly there reporting in Kyiv. Well, to talk now about Saudi Arabia's role in these negotiations, I'm joined by Kristin Diwan. She's a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. It's good to have you with us this evening. Let me ask you about Saudi Arabia. It is positioning itself as a neutral mediator in this conflict. Is that what it is?
I think that is the role it's trying to play. I don't see any interest on the Saudi side of taking sides in this. They're really just playing hosts and being facilitators for these talks. I think their interest and their eye is really much more on the United States and making sure that they keep really good, close ties with the Trump administration and show that they can be useful to the Trump administration. I think that's more of their interest, as well as just being host for these very important talks, which could lead to direct talks between, to end the war in the future, direct talks between Russia and the United States, perhaps with Ukraine. So obviously that really puts Saudi Arabia in a very prominent role globally, which is a huge achievement for the kingdom, which was really sidelined for some time after the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
Yeah, the optics of this are very important for Saudi Arabia. But if I understand you correctly, then it really comes down to Saudi Arabia as a mediator trying to make Donald Trump happy. Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, I think they're just trying to play that facilitating role. We know that they do have important ties with Russia, of course, through the OPEC Plus agreement, very important for the setting of global oil prices. But at the same time, they have been proper, I guess you can say, in their relations towards Ukraine, supporting them in the UN and their sovereignty in the UN, and also hosting previously last year a peace summit with Ukraine, which did not include Russia. So I think, again, they've been trying to place themselves on terms where they could be trusted by both sides. But really, their interest here is probably more looking towards the United States.
Saudi Arabia, we know, has facilitated prisoner exchanges during the war in Ukraine. Talk to us about Saudi Arabia's relationship with Russia and Ukraine. What do we know?
Yeah, just as I mentioned, most importantly for Saudi Arabia is their relations with Russia through the OPEC Plus agreement. This helps them to stabilize oil prices, which is, of course, still at the heart of their own economy and for Russia as well. Quite notably, the Biden administration was interested in disrupting those ties and hoping that they could bring Saudi Arabia to step away from those agreements that would allow the United States and the West to put more pressure on Russia. However, Saudi Arabia refused to do that, which I think shows you that they are going to keep, they see a value in keeping those ties with Russia. But as I mentioned, they also, as you're your correspondent had said, have been facilitating prisoner releases and have also held a peace summit with Ukraine and have had pretty proper relations with Ukraine as well.
And these images that we're seeing of the Ukrainian president with the Saudi crown prince, I mean, this has to be a huge PR win for the Saudi crown prince.
Yes, certainly. I mean, that's been the Saudi ambition since Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has come to power. They really want to position themselves much more centrally globally. Of course, previously they were mostly known as an oil power and perhaps, a global power in the Islamic world. But I think they really want to be much more at the center of world power, global powers, and this obviously gives them a fantastic opportunity to do just that.
Kristin Diwan with the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. We appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
For more on this, let's bring in Michael Kimmage. He's a history professor at the Catholic University of America. He studied and wrote books about the war in Ukraine and how it impacts Europe and the transatlantic relations with the United States. A great time to be talking to you, Professor. In just a few hours on Tuesday, the US Secretary of State and Ukrainian negotiators will hold talks in Saudi Arabia. Why is this meeting so crucial?
Well, I'm not sure if this particular meeting is so crucial. It's a part of a long process, but it follows on the heels of a catastrophic meeting between President Trump and President Zelenskyy a week ago Friday. And so the question is whether Ukraine can recover its position in the eyes of the White House or not. So it's very significant in that respect. But again, it's a part of a really long diplomatic process.
So it's about Ukraine recovering its position. Are they certain about the US's position? Can you walk us through the US perspective on this? How does the US administration think a ceasefire can be reached? And what role does the possible minerals deal with Ukraine play at this point?
Well, the Trump administration is assuming that the considerable military leverage that the US has over Ukraine is going to get Ukraine to make concessions that will be in some sense acceptable to Russia. Now, the details of this are all quite vague, but the idea is you charm Russia into concessions and you compel Ukraine into concessions, and somehow you get there. And the minerals deal is, an appeal on the part of the Trump administration to have Ukraine give something in return for the military aid that the U.S. is giving to Ukraine. So it's something of a transaction or something of a deal. Very much in the making, nothing definite on that front.
You mentioned the two key players. US President Trump's relationship with Zelenskyy remains difficult after their tumultuous White House meeting that you referenced. Stay with me. I want to play what he said on Sunday, a week later, in an interview on Fox News about the Ukrainian president.
He's a smart guy, and he's a tough guy. And he took money out of this country under Biden like candy from a baby. It was so easy, with that same attitude. And I just don't think he's grateful.
After so much bad blood, some of it you could hear present in what the President Trump had to say just now. Why is Ukraine talking to the US without the direct involvement in talks from other EU and NATO partners at the table?
Well, it seems to be that the way the U.S. prefers it, the Trump White House, is to have these discussions be bilateral. Certainly, the Trump administration has not gone out of its way to include the Europeans. And as of now, the diplomatic format is triangular. It's U.S.-Russia, U.S.-Ukraine, not too much Ukraine-Russia yet, but Europe has been left out of the picture, I think. In the eyes of the Trump administration, it makes things too complicated on the one hand, and I don't think that they see Europe having a great deal of leverage on the other.
Europe is trying to get that leverage, Professor. Europe has sprung into action in the last month, talking a bigger game on military spending, talking about boots on the ground in Ukraine as part of a ceasefire deal. How much has all that talk really changed the landscape in these talks?
I don't think it's changed the landscape yet. It's very significant, and I think it's a morale boost to Ukraine. And whatever uncertainties Ukraine has about the U.S., you can see that Germany and other countries in Europe are rushing to fill the gap. So it's very significant. But of course, the European changes are pledged changes about the future. And many of them, in the German case, in terms of increased military spending, many of them will take years to enact and will be felt only in the medium to long term. So, Europe is on the move, but one can't say that Europe is really on the move rapidly.
Right, Europe's on the move, and yet Ukraine is low on soldiers, low on ammunition, and now intelligence that the US is deliberately withholding. Is Ukraine's position as hopeless as it appears to be?
I don't think Ukraine's position is hopeless at all. As we've already discussed, Ukraine has a big network of supporters, not all of them in Europe. You have South Korea, you have Japan, you have Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and Canada. And Ukraine has made big advances in its drone weapon technology over the last year, which is drones that are produced in Ukraine itself. So there's a degree of dependence on the United States. It's very far from absolute. And in that sense, Ukraine is holding its own on the battlefield for good reason. So the opposite of hopeless.
How much should the signature of Vladimir Putin mean on a ceasefire deal to Ukraine and to Europe?
I wouldn't want to prejudge too much. Diplomacy is always a dance. It's a process. And there might be ways in which the US or the US plus Europe or the US plus Europe plus Ukraine can elicit real concessions from Russia. But past precedent would show that Vladimir Putin is very hard to trust. And certainly much of what he says in public cannot be taken as a guide to what he's committed to in private. So there's the old Cold War phrase, trust but verify. It applies in droves to Vladimir Putin.
History Professor Michael Kimmage, has been fantastic to get your input. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.